Welcome, everyone, to Penn State University Press's final publishing panel. And today we're going to be talking about history of the book matters. We're going to wait a minute or two as attendees come in. We appreciate you joining us today. It's my privilege to be here. I'm Patrick Alexander. I'm the director of Penn State University Press. I've been here for 15, almost 16 years, and it's been my privilege to work with a fine organization, wonderful colleagues, and this History of the Book panel reflects some of the kinds of scholarship that the press is devoted to. And I think you're in for a real treat today with some experts in the field. So I want to start by just introducing the panel today. And I'm going to, then they will be given a fuller biography as they present their material. But we have with us today Jeffrey Makala, author of Publishing Plates, Stereotyping, and Electrotyping in 19th-Century U.S. Print Culture. We have Melvyn New and Anthony Lee. These are the editors of Notes on Footnotes, Annotating 18th-Century Literature. And then also joining us is the editor of the series of Penn State History in the Book, Professor James L. W. West III, Professor Emeritus of English at Penn State University, and the series editor. And I'd like to start by asking Professor West if he could give us just a quick overview of his book series and his involvement with it. It's one that we're very proud of. So, Dr. West, may I turn to you?
Yes, Patrick, thanks. I'll begin actually by telling people a little bit about what exactly we mean by the title, History of the Book. This is a series in book history. But not everyone knows, and it's a broad umbrella. It's a big field. There are a lot of different kinds of approaches that one can take. So I think this will be helpful. The history of the book, or l'histoire du livre, it always sounds better in French, is a broad area of study in which scholars look into the creation and manufacture and dissemination of the written word. So we have participants from a great many fields: literature and history, sociology, economics, library studies, and many others. There is an active and very successful international group called SHARP, the Society for the History of Authorship, Reading, and Publishing. We had a convention at Penn State a few years ago. And our book series at Penn State is up to 30 titles now. In fact, I believe the two books under discussion today are the 30th and 31st in the series. And we have some very interesting books in the pipeline coming up, so we shall continue. We publish books that employ a mixture of approaches: historical, archival, biographical, critical, and the topics include such things as professional authorship, the literary marketplace, history of reading and libraries and book distribution, histories of publishing houses, and examinations of copyright and literary property. So that gives you some idea of what we do. And we move across many different periods, many cultures, different languages. It's a very interesting field, and many people are involved in it. I think that will give you a pretty good notion then of what we're up to.
Thank you so much, Professor West. Really appreciate that overview of the series. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce our first panelist, Jeffrey Makala. Is the Associate Director for Special Collections and University Archivist at Furman University. He is the co-editor of In Dogs We Trust, an anthology of American dog literature, and his new book, Publishing Plates, Stereotyping and Electrotyping in 19th-Century U.S. Print Culture, has just been released. And he's here to tell us a little bit more about that today. Thank you so much for joining us, Jeff. Look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Patrick. It's great to be here, and thank you, Jim, for all the help in stewarding this project through. It's been a great journey. I'm going to set my timer on my phone here in front of me to make sure I don't talk too much. And I want to start with an anecdote, quick, that kind of frames some of the things I was thinking about in the project, and then I'll stop and try to define stereotyping and electrotyping for you, for all the non-19th century book nerds in the audience, and then talk a little bit about how the scope progresses through the book. But Charles Babbage, the English mathematician, economist, computing pioneer, in 1832, he published a book called On the Economy of Machinery and Manufactures. And he had a chapter right at the beginning called Of Copying, where he laid out industrial manufacturers and the need for precision parts making and copying, all that sort of thing. In the middle of this chapter, he invited his readers to consider the printed page that they're holding in their hands, reading the book itself. And he says that the page before them was the final product, and I'm quoting him now, of 6 successful stages of copying. The initial carving of a punch, the creation of a matrix, the casting of type from the matrix, the forming of a plaster mold from the set type of the book's page, the casting of a stereotype plate from that mold, and then finally the reverse impression of the plate inked onto paper that the reader is reading right now. 6 successive stages of copying in mechanical processes to create a book in the 1830s. And for many books that were being produced in the 1830s, that's a pretty accurate description of the whole process. He was interested in standardization and textual accuracy, of course, and all these sorts of things. But he said that at stage 4, where the mold is being made from the set type, that is the stage at which he says the union of the intellectual and the mechanical takes place. And I really love that kind of trope, because that's exactly where this book is working and focused. The union of the intellectual and the mechanical by creating a stereotype or an electrotype plate from set type and then getting it out into the world as a material text. So stereotyping involved taking, the individual pieces of type that were then turned into letters or words, lines of type and forms that were set and locked up in a press. Instead of printing from the set type, a plate was made, and it started with a couple different processes, competing industrial processes, but plaster of Paris was the dominant Anglo-American one, and then they used paper mache, and you'd create a reverse impression of that set type as a mold. You would fill the mold with metal and shave it and make it uniform, and then put it onto a block of mahogany or brass to get it up to type height, and then print from the plate. So several advantages, clearly. One is that your type in the print shop was never actually printed from directly, so type lasted longer. The type was then able to be more quickly redistributed for other jobs because it wasn't tied up, locked up in forms waiting to be printed from. There was a upfront cost, of course, to make these plates, and for some well-capitalized publishers, that advantage proved very fortuitous and very profitable. For others, not so much. And the other clear advantage of printing from plates instead of printing from type is that the plates could be boxed and warehoused and brought out whenever a new impression or more copies were needed to be struck off. So instead of a publisher warehousing printed sheets, expensive paper being tied up and flammable paper being tied up as printed stock, instead a publisher could warehouse these metal plates and pull them out for printing whenever a couple hundred or a couple thousand new copies were needed. So for certain steady sellers like Bibles, like school books, like grammars, stereotyping presented a very clear advantage, with the upfront investment being able to be paid off over time. For other things like almanacs or city directories or things like that, newspapers initially and magazines, not so much. That would change by mid-century too, as industrial printing really takes off, and multiple newspapers are being printed from multiple sets of the same stereotype plates simultaneously. So it's a volume question as well. So the book starts really trying to write an early history of stereotyping in the United States. The last monograph on the topic was published 80 years ago. So it's been time for some updating. And we have access to all sorts of databases and wonderful resources now that we didn't have back then, obviously. So it's trying to pull together the earliest tracings and instances of this practice in the United States, tracing it back to its English and French origins. Should say that there are many successful and unsuccessful attempts at doing just this practice, going back to, if we believe Paul Needham, going back to Gutenberg and the Catholicon. So 500 years of experiments in doing this, but it was really successfully realized first in the 1790s in France by Didot, and then in the early 1800s by Earl of Stanhope in England. American typographers and type founders went over to England and studied with some of his people and brought it back to America around 1812, 1813. And so the book spends some time kind of fleshing out the networks and the ways in which it was established in New York primarily in the 18 teens, and then goes in depth to look at a couple instances at how publishers or printers were successfully or not successfully managing this transition, acquiring plates and printing from them, or acquiring plates and not printing from them, or commissioning works to be cast into plates successfully or unsuccessfully as the landscape of printing and publishing in early 19th century America starts to change. The common understanding of industrialization of the printing trades is that there's this 30-year period between 1810 and 1840 when all sorts of industrial innovations happen quickly, all at the same time. So stereotyping and electrotyping, machine-made paper, the introduction of power presses, railway networks that can actually, shift and distribute printed matter far and wide. And all these things happen within one generation. And I would argue that stereotyping was the innovation that is probably the most important at transforming what was an artisan apprenticeship printing publishing model that goes back 400 plus years in the West into the modern publishing industry like we know it today, which really emerged in America in the middle of the 19th century with larger nationally based publishers in the real sense. And so the book kind of tries to trace that and situate stereotyping in the midst of a very rapid period of technological changes in the printing trades. And then, of course, once these plates are made, they are out into the world, so they become material texts. Quite literally, they are embodied forms of capital, of literature, of selfhood for their authors. And so there's a secondhand market that emerges in stereotype plates as they sort of move through their lifespans, as publishers use them to raise or capital, or publishers go bankrupt and liquidate, the plates still exist. And so what happens to them? So that's another part of the universe. And then finally, once these innovations are out there and we have this material text universe, language and literature and culture starts to change. Cultures of plates emerge, both true and false. Questions of veracity kind of bubble up. We have stereotype plates, we have daguerreotypes, we have slave tags in Charleston imprinted. We have the Book of Mormon being discovered in an area of upstate New York where stereotype plates and stereotype printing is known to be had and done. And of course, what does that mean with the author-publisher relationship and all sorts of other things that kind of bubble up. And of course, stereotyping becomes part of our language now, and it becomes not just a synonym for copying, but a derogatory term for bad copying in language now. And how does stereotyping become stereotyped? So I'll stop there. I think my time's up. And hopefully that's just enough teasers to have some good questions in a little bit. So thank you for your time and attention. I'll stop now.
Jeffrey, thank you so much. I learned a lot just in that short period of time. Next, I'd like to introduce Melvyn New. He's professor emeritus at the University of Florida. He is the general editor of the Florida Stern, published in 9 volumes between 1978 and 2014. His most recent editorial work has been as co-editor of the Sir Charles Grandison for the Cambridge edition of the works of Samuel Richardson, published in 2022. We're delighted to have Professor New, who is the co-editor for the volume before us today on the footnotes and annotations in 18th century literature. So we'll first go to Professor New, and also we will be talking perhaps a little bit of overlap with Anthony Lee, who is the author or editor of 8 books, including most recently Community and Solitude, New Essays on Johnson's Circle, Samuel Johnson Among the Modernists, and A Clubbable Man, Essays on 18th Century Literature in honor of Greg Klingham. His current projects include an edition of Samuel Johnson's Rambler, edition of David Fleeman's Selected Papers on Johnson, and edition of Arthur Murphy's biography of Johnson. So I welcome you both at this time, and each of you is going to be talking about the book Footnotes and Annotations in 18th Century Literature. Welcome.
So I should start, and
Yes.
You can all hear me. Okay. Well, first thing, I noticed we have 26 participants, so I'm hoping some of them are contributors, and I'll take this occasion to thank any of the contributors. Some have written that they could not make it, but if any of you are out there, thank you, and thank you for your contribution. And then I want to thank Patrick. We go back a little way before this. He helped save the Scriblarian. When my good friend and editor Blake Gerard died, the journal was in trouble, and working with Penn State University Press, we were able to put it together, and he's done a fine job helping us do that. And it's 2 issues have now come out, and I think it's on the way to an enduring life. James West and I embarrass him and tell him we go back to 1985. So that's what, 40 years. I submitted an article which will tell you something about my work, Wim-Wams and Flim-Flams, to his review journal, 25-page review of the Oxford edition of Tristram Shandy. And the title of my review says what I thought of it, Flim-Flam in particular. And then I just also wanted to thank Kate, of course, for setting this up. And I want to thank Regina for the cover design. I thought that was brilliant. The parchment paper for notes on footnotes. It's hard to always have one place where something starts. But I think I had an idea of doing this collection on annotation from a footnote in a wonderful, by a wonderful Australian, now deceased, Simon Lays, his name is, who wrote this sentence: "Which one of us would not dream that it might be said of his work of a lifetime, he wrote a few good footnotes?" And I just thought that sat there for me. And I had finished the last volume of the Stern edition. I was in the middle of the Richardson, which took a very long time, unfortunately. And it was probably the Richardson project that brought this quote into the front burner, so to speak, and said, we ought to talk about annotation. Because the history of the Cambridge edition, which I can cart up here, this is it. Grandison is a huge novel, you all know that. And the question became whether we should have what they call, the general editors call, the Florida annotations, or I suppose the Cambridge annotations, which I took to mean either good annotations or thin annotations. And so we went back and forth over many years, back and forth arguing this point. I wasn't quite sure why they added me as one of the editors if they did not like Florida annotations. But my graduate student, Derek Taylor, was another participant. And that's why I was part of this project. And Elizabeth Kraft, who has contributed to Notes on Footnotes, is the third editor, again, a co-editor. So I think it was this discussion about fullness and conciseness that spurred us putting together this project. And it's never going to be solved. As the essays in the collection suggest, everybody who annotates is torn between fullness, richness, and getting to the point, giving the information that is required, not too much extraneous material. I haven't counted the number of collections I've edited, but I think between Tony and me, it's probably 15 or so. And I think we would both agree that no collection has ever been easier to put together. We got a good group of people, scholars who had accomplished a great deal in their careers, some older than others. I think one is even older than I am, and that might be Max Novak. But all of us had worked for many years on editorial projects, and everyone seemed very eager to share the experience. And so this is a scholarly volume, but it is also a rather personal volume if you can separate the two. People wanted to talk about their experience, the problems they faced, the individual author that they were trying to annotate, and the problems that that author, for example, Swift can be very difficult, Pope, obviously so, with as much detailed historical information as you have to bring to their text. And of course, some of us have had experience not only in annotating texts, but in reviewing other texts, reviewing the work of other annotators, other editors. I'm reminded Rob Hume wasn't able to be here, I don't think, but he wrote about his experience, and I've just read a review of his in the Scriblarian, some 7 pages, devastating an editorial project, and I won't give you the details, but we have evaluated other people's work as part of being editors ourselves. And I think that's important, and I think that experience shows up And it might show up in my own piece in this, which is The Angry Annotator Annotated. And I was responding to a review by Bliss Carnakin, in which he said that I had a rather testy attitude toward the profession. And I think I'm very humorous, actually, not testy, but that's okay. Unfortunately, I wrote this thinking he would be amused by it. And while the book was in press, he died. And that's one of the great regrets I have about our exchanges. But we did have, I think, a friendly and good exchange. While no one has yet suggested a parallel statement to my first comment, which one of us would not dream it might be said of his work of a lifetime, he wrote a few good blurbs. I do want to praise Cynthia Wall's blurb for our cover. Namely that every single essay is not just readable, but entertaining. That was particularly pleasing to me because I found every essay filled with the sort of relish, really good humor that seems rarer and rarer in scholarly writing today. People who actually enjoy what they are doing. And I'll go back to my review for Professor West, calling something whim whams and flim flams. To me, that was a bit of humor, but some people might not agree with that. One other point that I wanted to make is at the same time, and this is true for all contributors to the volume, as well as being editors and annotators, we also had careers as literary scholars, as critics. And I don't think there's enough attention paid to the fact that you can do both, and perhaps should be doing both. And again, I think this comes through in the essays in this collection. All of the contributors have written about their period, about the 18th century, in addition to their editing work. So part of why I'm into this project is because of age. You reach the end of a career and you're ready to sum it up. And my last project, I think it's going to be my last project, is another collection of essays, but these will be my own essays, my own critical work. 13 essays published in the last 30 years. And in the introduction, I make the point that it's my impatience that made me an editor. The inability to stay with one subject the way that people who write monographs are able to stay with that one subject. In this, I think I share something, or at least can understand what Johnson saw in editing a dictionary or in putting together a dictionary. It's one problem at a time. And when you solve that problem, you can go on to another problem. You don't have to stay doing the same thing over and over again as with a monograph. And so editing for me was a way to deal with impatience, with getting one page and then another page and then another page, one problem, a second problem, and a third. This is not to say that I don't like the Florida style, where an annotation can run on for a couple of pages. And in fact, my ultimate dream would be to emulate Robert Merton's book On the Shoulders of Giants, where he started with, I'm just going to footnote where that phrase comes from. And 300 pages later, he gives us a book on the subject. I think that's not only a worthy idea, but the phrase itself, we are pygmies standing on the shoulders of giants, is really what editors are. We build on the work of others, and we hope we will be the shoulders upon which the next pygmy will stand. And I think, again, the contributors to the volume all would understand how much we owe to others, which is why, if you check the dedication of the volume, you will see that it's not to friends and family, although they were all important, I'm sure, to everyone, but to Patrick Hume, Edmund Malone, and Pierre Boyle, three 17th, 18th century editors about whom one can say, particularly about Pierre Boyle, he annotated everything he could get his hands on. And that's my kind of person, I think. Thank you. Mute.
We really appreciate it, Mel. Thank you so much for this. And the second editor of Notes on Footnotes, Dr. Anthony Lee, is going to share with us his experience and insights into this. Welcome, Professor Lee.
Thank you. I'm going to set my timer as well, which means my phone is on, so hopefully we won't get any distracting noise. Thank you very much, Patrick. I'd like to thank Patrick and Jim, and also an eminence of Greece, Kate Frick, who is behind the scenes here, making sure everything goes properly in a technical sense. So I'm grateful to all of you, and also for producing such a fine book as this one. I got my copy this week, and it just is, as an object, it's a work of art. You know, as Mel pointed out, the cover is extremely original and creative, and the pages are beautifully rendered. The quality of the paper and the print fonts are easy to read. It's just a magnificent achievement that I'm very proud of, not because of my participation, but because of the book itself. Let me also thank Mel, Dr. Melvyn, who asked me to accompany him on this journey. And I think it began about 4 years ago, if I'm correct, maybe 5, 2018 or so. And the fact that the book has had such a quick turnaround indicates and verifies what he said about the willingness of the contributors to really dig into this project and to offer genuinely and sincerely their love of critical annotation. And we had no problems with people reluctantly sitting back and holding up the rest of the convoys. The only fast is the slowest ship. So we had none of that, and that was a unique experience. So I'm very grateful also to the contributors of this volume. And Mel talks about being the angry annotator, or the curmudgeon, in his introduction to the volume. Angry Annotator is his chapter. And as he just disarmingly said, that he's not so much of a growling bear as people think. And I agree with him in that respect. I think whatever gruff exterior he might have, he possesses a genuinely large and kind and generous heart. And his willingness to collaborate with someone such as me, who's vastly inferior in terms of knowledge compared to him, was a real boost for my ego. And I might say that the years that I spent working with him were a kind of an apprenticeship from which I learned a great deal from a master scholar, and I'm very grateful for that. For the book itself, it's entertaining, as Mel mentioned, and I want to just point out a few things as I go along. On page 142, in a chapter called Footnote Failures, which is humorous in itself, he's talking about primarily Fielding in this chapter. He was the editor, is the editor of it. It's Thomas Lockwood. If I forgot to mention that, Thomas Lockwood is the editor of the Fielding editions, the drama, the plays, and he talks about that quite a bit in here. But the last sentence, I like to believe that failing better, if not succeeding, is possible even in hard cases like this. He's referring to an earlier crux. Given more time and imagination for the search. And he closes with a colon, but ars longa, and etc. And he has a note to that, note 26, and the note reads, "Look it up yourself." So that sense of humor, or that sense of disarming authorial presence or projection into this book is true of everyone. No one takes themselves too seriously, but they do make serious points. And I wanted to emphasize a few things. I found out yesterday that I only have 8 minutes. And I'm already down to 3, and I haven't even said anything cogent about the book yet. But I took Mel's observation that he just dilated on a bit. And it's on page 4. Good annotators will have at least one abiding certainty. Whatever we annotate will be too little for some and too much for others. And in either case, boundaries defining our content will change over time. This means to me that that footnotes or endnotes are not arbitrary, but there are different schools of thought in terms of what is appropriate for the length or size of the note, and also the content. There are different fields of or different schools, might one say, about what one might say about the type of note. And Robert Hume talks about this, and he goes back to Arthur Friedman, who was the editor of the Oxford Goldsmith works, and distinguishes between explanatory notes and notes of, let's see, what is the exact word he uses? Explanatory notes and essentially notes that go back into the past and try to offer supplemental information that's not necessarily directly related to the text, but fills out some of the context. And even that notion is a conundrum for some people. What is the proper approach to take in the note? Michael Edson in particular talks about this when he discusses the sort of the editorial model that one undertakes. Whether one, well, for one tradition, the annotator looks at the author's intention, or what the author was trying to say. And of course, that is a very nebulous thing in and itself, as we learned from New Critics, the intentional fallacy, and also what the early readers made of it. And that was a tradition that lasted for many years. But more recently, that was challenged, and in different, particularly in the 80s, when deconstruction criticism came out and had quite a field day in attacking more traditional and respectable scholars. That's going off.
Take a few more minutes, Anthony.
Just
No-
shut that down. Basically,
no-
let me say this. I identified 10 different types of annotated practice that I found reading through the book yesterday and this morning. And one is following a rule or a theory. And I just alluded to the notes of recovery. That's what the phrase I was looking for, an explanatory note that Friedman and one other, I forget the other critic, maybe Martin Baston, wrote essays on those premises. And so if you have that sort of rule in mind, then that will guide you in your annotated practice. Another possibility is using an assigned style from a work, a series of works by different editors, such as the California, Dryden, and Max Novak talks about the editorial policy there, which derives from one of the founders of the California, Dryden, Edward Hooker, and he based it on his own edition of John Dennis's, his critical edition of John Dennis. So an annotator in that situation is working under the constraints or harness or guidance of a particular series. There's the setting forth of this editorial policy and its abandonment or misuse by individuals, editors, and that's exemplified by the Yale edition of Samuel Johnson's, the works of Samuel Johnson, and Robert Demaria talks about this a great deal in his chapter on the edition. There's no one single volume that's standard. They're all different focus, different foci upon how to do notes and how long notes should be. From the very lean notes of the Rambler to the very more full notes of people such as Donald Green and especially Gwen Kolb. Learning, basing a model after years of experience, that's number 4, and or number 5. A good example of that is Robert Hume, who lists 6 principles for annotation in his chapter, and then Mel himself mentioned the Florida style. So, and he was largely responsible for the entire Stern edition. So the regularity in that one, that particular edition, is based upon one man's notions. And then Kate Bennett talks about in the first chapter creating an annotated model that is specific to the particular author, the demands of that author. And her author is John Aubrey. And his work is this vast, very prolific, and it's scattered all over the place. And she uses 3 different manuscripts to try and piece together all of the things that could be gathered together and correctly called contributions to his brief lives, the title of his work. Focusing on annotating a specific genre. And again, Rob Hume does that with the genre of drama, particularly restoration comedy. Learning from mentor, Bob DeMaria talks about his experiences with Gwen Kolb in his chapter, how Gwen took him to higher levels of annotation than he had previously realized. In fact, Bob gave a really delightful talk on this topic in Atlanta at ASEX when there was a memorial tribute to Gwen Kolb. And I wish that he would publish that because it's very informative and entertaining. And Richard Sher sent me an email in which he, working with the Yale edition of Boswell's works, he said that when he started working with his own volume, Boswell Forbes edition, under Gordon, annotation standards were above and beyond anything I'd ever seen before. So working with a particular person who's expert can have a tremendous impact upon the type of annotation that is practiced. And then number 9 is trial and error, basically going into it with a naive perspective and no preset ideas. And that would be me and Elizabeth Kratt and Alan Roper, who's not in this volume, but it's mentioned by Max Novat, was a brilliant editor with the California edition. And he told me via email that he learned from trial and error, which gave me great confidence to go forth on my own and probably make massive blunders. But it was a comfort to know that he started as I did. And finally, the ideal text is addressed by Chef Rogers at the University of Otago in New Zealand. And I'll try to, I don't know if this is legible to the viewers, but he has a facsimile reproduction on one side, and then on the facing side, he has annotation. And so if you look at the book, you can see there's a really spacious area where the notes can be put. They're not cramped at the bottom of the page. And they're not remote from the page at the end of a section or at the end of the book. So in conclusion, and I'm sorry I had to rush through that so quickly, I will read this from what I wrote last night. There is no single consensus of a standard approach to annotation, either in theory or practice, emerging from this book, Notes and Footnotes. Rather, it is, to quote Henry Fielding, a bill of fare of prodigious variety, or Ben Jonson, who writes, our wishes, like those to make public feast, are not to please the cook's taste, but the guests. So they both use elementary analogies there in the discussing the realm of writing, but I think that applies quite aptly to Notes and Footnotes. There is no consensus on what one should do. There's no overriding theory. Everybody comes to the topic with different perspectives and different models and different practical approaches. And
Thank
so,
you, Anthony. I'm sorry to interrupt you. We really need to leave a little time for some Q&A, but thank you so much for that comment and commentary. I do want to open it up for some questions from our numerous participants. I also want to thank our panelists right now for such a great presentation on your projects. And so we'll, and you can also ask questions of one another. In fact, I wanted to start with a question for Jeff Makala. Jeff, I was struck by in your book that the American Bible Society embraced stereotyping, and how much did this dramatically affect ABS's ability to disseminate copies? It must have been just incredible.
They formed in 1816 from an amalgamation of regional and local Bible societies around the country for the express purpose of doing that, of acquiring stereotype plates, because they knew the technology was out there and they could exponentially increase the output of cheap Bible production that individual or local or regional Bible societies couldn't. So stereotyping was directly responsible for their amalgamation and formation. And within 5 years, they were producing, 20, 30,000 Bibles a year from multiple sets of plates. It was a tremendous just explosion in volume.
Yes, yes, that's amazing. That's amazing.
Well, I was going to say, apropos of stereotyping and electrotyping, it really did change the game for publishers. Most of us remember maybe 20 years ago, a lot of talk about capturing the initial keystroke. And that was a great change when personal computers came in. Well, that's essentially what these publishers are trying to do. They're trying to have one outlay of payment for typesetting a book, and then to capture that typesetting and store it and use it again and again and sell it, have the plates become items of capital, as Jeff said. But one of the things that happened to authors, particularly fiction writers and poets, was that the text was therefore frozen. And this put great limits on their ability or desire to revise and correct. Because once a plate is cast, it really is a rather elaborate procedure and an expensive one to go back in and chisel out the first text and to mortise in the second text. The only way you can discover this, if you are editing, let us say, 20th century writings that have been stereotyped, is to put 2 copies of the book on a Hinman collator or a Lindstrand comparator or some other optical device and have the variants, in essence, lift off the page. Otherwise, if you just look at the 2 pages, they look the same. So the only other way would be to do the old head wagging form of collation, in which you look at 3 words over here and the next 3 over here, and back and forth you go, which takes forever and causes mental problems for graduate students who are asked to do this. So I've been dealing with books that were plated ever since my beginnings as an editor. I would also tell you that authors themselves tried to figure out ways that they could own their own printing plates. That gave them control over the text, physical control. They owned the text itself, and they could thereby control who published it and when and in what numbers. Theodore Dreiser, for instance, acquired the plates of Sister Carrie, his first novel, and he hung on to them for the remainder of his career, and they turned out to be very valuable to him. Again and again, they pounded away with those old plates and republished the book. But of course, his ability to revise or change was very much limited literally by the metal, metal, of the plate. So these are the things that more modern editors deal with, editors of more recent texts, when they deal with books that have been stereotyped or electrotyped.
The ABS was plagued from the start with local regional ministers writing in to complain about textual variants in the Bibles they were producing. And they ended up hiring a full-time proofreader / corrector of plates, who was basically working for them full-time just to chisel out, do that literal chiseling out and the various plates to Bibles to get it more textually accurate. Yeah.
Well, you know, Jeff, one of the things that I always used to tell my graduate students in the first meeting of a seminar on scholarly editing was that everything we do in literary editing really derives from the editing of Holy Scriptures. And all of our, of any kind of translation, of preservation of the text, and particularly of to get over into what Mel and Tony were doing, annotation and explanation. Explication is the word that both sides use. That's what the preacher does from the pulpit on Sunday morning, and it's what we do when we explain what our texts mean. So we are the priests, I suppose, who are interpreting the Holy Scriptures, but we all of that derives, all that we do derives from the editing of sacred texts. So it's
All heirs to St. Jerome.
Maybe I can interrupt here. I can read a passage from my introduction to Notes on Footnotes. I make the comment that the lowly annotator of an 18th century text, but if we think of, say, Tom Jones as a commentary on Paradise Lost, and Paradise Lost, a commentary on both Scripture and the Iliad, to make a simplifying leap, we might suggest that those who offer interpretations of Fielding are within a tradition of commentary that stretches back to the unknown word. And all along that route, alongside the brilliant and even less than brilliant bursts of insight and artistic merit, each text deemed worthy has been accompanied by annotations that underwrite interpretation. The two would seem to be inextricably linked, even at times indistinguishable. Art as it may sound, no work of imaginative genius has ever survived very long without annotation, because none can survive without being read. And being read means being commented on, and commentary and form to continue over time depends on annotation. Little did I think when I started this introduction that I would discover the annotator to be the operative cog in the great chain of literary being, but so it turns out, QED.
Amen. Amen.
We're about out of time, but we have about 30 seconds for an answer for Doctors New and Lee. Do you find that the style of the text to be annotated influences the annotation itself? For example, does Cormac McCarthy earn shorter footnotes while Dickens gets the flowery ones? And then you got about 20 seconds.
Actually, Justin is a former student of mine who's teaching in Japan. So I might take a stab at that. I don't know if I can do it in 20 seconds, but yeah, I think the time lapse between the modern annotator and the text that is being annotated determines more than the style, because of the distance in time means that we don't know all of the allusions and references that a more Latin literate audience of readers would have had at the time, and also the meaning of words that look the same have changed in their semantic.
Well,
So,
We
yeah,
really
there's a long answer to that question, but I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. We really appreciate everybody's time, the participation from the attendees, and thank each and every one of you. I think that Kate is going to tell me it's that we were at 2 o'clock and have to close the event. So thank you all and have a great weekend.
Thank you.